Hello everyone, welcome to the YouTube channel, Roaming Tendencies. If you stumbled across this video, this is the very first video on the channel, so welcome and thank you for watching. My plan is to do a series of book reviews to stimulate discussion around ideas that I find important and of concern to the general well-being of people, or just engaging, stimulating conversation starters. I'll be covering both classic works and contemporary, recently released books. I'm going to try and keep the talks short, between 5 and 10 minutes, hopefully. I really don't have a good feel for, how long what I'm going to say will take, but that's my, sort of goal, is to keep it under 10 minutes, because I don't want to give away the whole book, essentially. I want to encourage you to go out and read it for yourself, and then perhaps respond in the comments, but give you enough of an overview of the important points that if you don't go read the book, you still take away something that might be helpful to you. The first book that I'm going to cover is Lost Connections by Johann. It's a book that I read recently. Well, actually, I listened to it on an audio book for the most part on a road trip down the California coast this past March with my partner, Emily. We were totally engrossed in it. We listened to it for a good majority of the ride, and then I took this copy out of the Scranton Public Library, and it is overdue. I believe I've accrued the maximum fine, so I'll be returning it this afternoon. I'm sorry, Scranton Albright Memorial Library. Lost Connections coming back your way in just an hour or two, and I'll settle up the fine, keep everything above board. So that's the reason we're doing the talk right now, is that I want to, settle my debt to the library. So the book's not as fresh in my mind as it ideally would be, but I believe that I've considered the ideas within it enough to, be able to speak about it, or at least give a reasonable synopsis of the book. Essentially, it's divided into 3 parts. The first one sort of challenges and confronts myths and ideas about depression in our society. The subtitle of the book is Uncovering the Real Causes of Depression and the Unexpected Solutions. And I was first introduced to this book by way of a recommendation to read Johann Hari's other book, Chasing the Scream, about the war on drugs, which is actually still sitting on my shelf. Hopefully there'll be a talk in the coming weeks on that book. But I've familiarized myself with the basic premises of his work, watched his TED Talk and a handful of other videos, and then dove into this book. So the first thing I'll say is that, I would rate it 10 out of 10. I absolutely recommend that you go check out this book, as well as his additional work, and just, engage with his thinking and his ideas. And I think they're important and have tremendous potential to help people and to shake some, problematic, limiting narratives we have. So, in a nutshell, I would say that the basic thesis of the book is that there is a social cause for depression, that, it is not entirely or not at all a chemical phenomenon, that it is foremost a social phenomenon that, is spurred on by the conditions in which an individual finds himself living. That the idea that a person's brain is broken or imbalanced or limited, or is just, simply not secreting enough serotonin, that there's a dearth of a neurotransmitter, that idea is doesn't hold water clinically and is not true and is not helpful in alleviating depression. And I mean, that, to me, it immediately rang true. I thought, wow, okay, that's spot on. I've never quite bought that theory, but I hadn't necessarily really brought a lot of critical thinking to it. And I'll very briefly go into a little bit of my own experience. I'm in recovery from addiction. I've been abstinent from drugs and alcohol for 6 years. Previously had a bad run with addiction to heroin, cocaine, and alcohol, as well as coinciding depression and anxiety that I think were had played into an exasperation, sort of vicious cycle with the chemical dependency. I don't think that one necessarily was predicated upon the other. I think that they, played into each other. And certainly, as my addiction isolated me from other people, I found myself in exactly the types of scenarios that Johann talks about in his book, being isolated from others, not having meaningful relationships or close confidants, not having a meaningful outlet for community engagement, not working in a way that felt purposeful and like I was utilizing or expanding my potential. And then obviously there was a huge just habituation piece to it. It was just physically addicted to and dependent on these substances. But I don't want to segue too far off into that. Looking at this timer here, we're already at 6 minutes, so if I want to keep true to my word, I got 4 minutes to hopefully hook you in to go read this book. So it's broken up into 3 sections. The first one, like I said, kind of challenges the basic narratives about depression and anxiety. The second one outlines 9 causes of disconnection. Maybe I'll just open it up and quickly rattle those off from the table of contents here. Cause 1, disconnection from meaningful work. Cause 2, disconnection from other people. Cause 3, disconnection from meaningful values. Cause 4, disconnection from childhood trauma. Cause 5, disconnection from status and respect. Cause 6, disconnection from the natural world. Cause 7, disconnection from a hopeful or secure future. Cause 8 and 9, the role of genes and brain changes. And in part 3, he goes on to prescribe a course of reconnection, in his vision for a society that did not give rise to depression and anxiety in such baffling numbers, because I do believe there's a depression epidemic in, across the world. In the United States, where I live, I know there's, something like 20,000 gun suicides a year. Many of my friends in addiction have taken their own life or died of an accidental overdose that could easily be construed as a suicide. So, there's traces of pharmaceutical antidepressants in most municipal water supplies. I Googled that fact, interestingly. This is an aside. When I read that in this book, I'd heard that fact in passing before, and I Googled it, and I found countless news stories stating that fact, and they dated back until 1999. And interestingly, as there's this sort of tendency to, present things in a vacuum and sort of eschew an ongoing, interconnected narrative, each one presented the, claim as if it was the first time this was coming to light, and we should all be, oh, wow, look at the new news that came out, there's antidepressants in the water. And it's like, there's almost a 20-year span of stories telling us this, and none of these stories are saying what we might do about that fact. What might be done to remedy that. It's just such a problem that we can't filter out antidepressants out of people's piss. But none of these stories make a suggestion about what might be done to rectify this situation. And granted, I know that's not the role of journalism, is to be impartial and objective and report facts. But, we all know that stories impart a personal slant. And a lot of them were in outlets where that's not they're not confined to those parameters. There were stories that, took a stance, presented ideas. But I found them pretty limited in their scope. Going back to the beginning of the book, that first of the 3 sections I mentioned, one of the most compelling portions of the book I thought was where Johann talked about the fact that the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, has removed all of the exemptions for life situations that might precipitate an experience of depression. Particularly, I believe there used to be a clause that stated that if someone had very recently experienced the death of a close loved one, that the symptoms of depression would likely be present in their life, but that it wouldn't be cause for a diagnosis, because it would be a reasonable, explainable, appropriate response to their life situation. Which of course also, begs the question, okay, if this is a reasonable exemption, if having a family member die, is reasonable to, elicit depression, then why not other situations, and he goes on to list situations that, could reasonably precipitate an experience of depression: the loss of a job, an experience of addiction, feeling trapped, feeling frustrated with your schooling, trying desperately to get out of debt and not being able to, being unable to find reasonable housing in a neighborhood that you feel happy to live in, not feeling like you have strong friendships. You go on and on about the, reasons that, or situations a person could find themselves in that would be, cause for depression. So rather than tackle that nuance and start to unpack that and give, good, thorough care, the response was to say, okay, axe the exemptions, no more exemptions, which I think is telling, and that's a common pattern I see, is like, rather than take on the complexity and, say, let's name this, let's wade through it, let's get our hands dirty, like, maybe somebody's depression is chemical and is not explainable because on the surface everything looks good. Another person's is, pretty explainable. Their life is a train wreck, and, the reasonable response would be to feel depressed. So that tendency to eschew complexity, I think, is increasingly common in a society where every interaction is expedited, everything is reduced down to, its simplest term, especially where healthcare is, a for-profit industry in the United States. A doctor's time is valued very highly, and to get through the sort of interpersonal, communication about the interpersonal events in their life, and make a judgment as to whether or not it qualifies them as clinically depressed or it's, an appropriate situational response would demand more time. We simply don't want to allot it to that. Or if we do, it's, it's compartmentalized as talk therapy, which is separate maybe from the person who prescribes your drugs. And I've encountered that. It almost seems like in addiction treatment centers, it's standard protocol to prescribe antidepressants, or, since a lot of sleeping medications have an abuse potential, there's the use of the off-label use of the antipsychotics to help people sleep, trazodone and Seroquel and this kind of thing. It's almost like a knee-jerk response. It seems like, oh, you're in an addiction treatment center, here's your antidepressants. It's almost like your check-in procedure. And at a certain point, I started to think, no shit, I'm depressed. I am in an addiction treatment center, like, I have the 3 open cases. My, parents are heartbroken. I only have superficial, surface-level friends that I get high with. Like, I feel completely hopeless about the future. I don't have a job. I don't have any money. Like, I want to commit suicide. Like, of course I'm depressed, And maybe the medication is important and is going to be a, factor in a person's integrative addiction treatment. But, to just rubber stamp, oh, you're depressed, medicate, it's just not the sort of compassionate, intelligent, nuanced approach to things that I would like to see. I'm already at 14 minutes here talking about the book, so I'll just quickly say, I think it's a compelling argument. It's so well elaborated on in a compelling style of writing and journalism. It's really truly a sound work of the social sciences. I know some, depending on your orientation towards things or, what sort of disciplines you're interested in, you might, sociology can be a little watery and subjective and this and that. I think it's good, hard, well-researched stuff. He clearly talked to a ton of people. So, I ended up Googling a number of the people he interviewed and reading their own journal articles and, checking out their work. There was a gentleman that did some really interesting stuff about loneliness, and there was a statistic in there that, the most common reported answer when people are asked, how many close confidants they have is zero. Most people respond zero. It's the most frequent answer. And that makes sense to me. I believe that, and I see that. I also think that that's devastatingly sad. So go out and talk to your neighbors. Meet the people that live in your street. Don't judge people by the way they look. If there's somebody who's sad, whatever, downtrodden, doesn't look like you, doesn't talk like you, you could save somebody's life by fucking starting a conversation with them. I believe that, because I've experienced that. Gosh, there's a lot to talk about, in this last minute or two here. I'm going to try and wrap it up. I appreciated his, work is, the way he engaged with meditation and spiritual work, because it could seem to be in conflict with the idea that depression has a social cause could seem to be in conflict with, the thought that it's a psychological innate quality, like a way of being for a person that's independent of their circumstances. I don't think that, I don't want to dwell off too much into the philosophical kind of underpinnings. I don't think that those are necessarily in conflict. And I think a life of community engagement, service to others, work towards positive social change can rectify the underlying causes of depression. I appreciated that he pointed out that meditation can become an individualistic pursuit, a sort of effort at self-improvement, and I think that that's a pretty limited way to undertake those practices. I'll get more into that in other videos. I'm planning on having, guided meditation practices, yoga practices, workouts, all sorts of things. And then, the book reviews, I think, will be a foundation of the videos offered here. Gosh, what else to say? One of the criticisms I heard of the book was that it's socialist, it's a socialist prescription for depression. And to that, I would say, damn right, I think he's done a masterful job of presenting, a 21st century. It's reformist. It's not radical revolution, fire to the bankers kind of thing. It's, it's not. It's palatable to the average person, and it doesn't use ideological words that are alienating, but it doesn't shy away from the fact that there are structural causes in inequity and the inability to have a voice at work, about wealth inequality, that issue about the voice at work is big. I have, even in the time that I've been in recovery from depression and addiction, when I have found myself in employment situations where I felt like no one cared what I had to say and there wasn't, an outlet for growth, resources were allocated inequitably, there wasn't transparency, I didn't feel like, the initiatives I had or the good ideas I had would be heard. That's depressing. You don't want to get out of bed and go to a job like that where you think, man, I have a good idea and nobody gives a shit. Like, I'm just a body, if I hit the floor, they'll take me to the hospital to cover their ass on the liability, and then they'll put an ad on Indeed later that day, so nobody feels good like that. So he talks about universal basic income, cooperative, work structures, and things that I think are great ideas. You'll gather from my future videos that I, take a left-wing stance on things, definitely what would be, characterized as a left-wing stance on it, sort of, broadly aligned with different tendencies. But anyway, that's it. I hope it was pretty meandering, and I about doubled the time I said that I would talk about the book. But hopefully, somewhere along the way, you got convinced to either read Lost Connections by Johann, or at the very least, watch his TED Talk, go to his webpage, consider some of these ideas, consider the fact that depression could have a social cause, and that the way we live and structure our lives and whether or not we are in healthy, viable communities has huge repercussions for the quality of our life. So go out, talk to your neighbors, get involved in something positive, get outside of yourself, do something for somebody else, and if you're struggling with depression, this book, I do believe that for somebody in the throes of depression, it could be transformative. It's a slippery slope in making a claim like that, because anybody that's experienced depression knows that, even if I was watching this video of me right now saying, "Yeah, read this book," yeah, you won't be impressed anymore. I'd be like, you know, but I do. I mean, it's you know, it's a sound, digestible presentation of a really radical, potentially transformative idea. So check it out. I'm going to link to his site, you know, and give him all the appropriate accolades and credit in this review. And that's it.